Did you know that the vast majority of the South African wine drinking public will call any sparkling wine champagne? In the infinitesimally small minority of instances, it actually is champagne from the region of Champagne. But for the vast majority of the rest of the time, it's more likely to be carbonated wine, or at its best, a bottle of Cap Classique, which is South Africa's premium tier of sparkling wine. Essentially, to make a bottle of Cap Classique, you have to mirror all the winemaking criteria of a bottle of champagne. Perhaps the biggest difference in the winemaking between making a bottle of champagne and making a bottle of Cap Classique in South Africa is that South African winemakers have absolute freedom with regards to the choice of cultivar that they use to make the bottle. But aside from that, the requirements and steps and processes are identical to that of champagne. Now, we're pondering the world of sparkling wine because today's hand-drink solo wine of the day is the RebelRebel Cinsault Méthode Ancestrale. Many folk will view the term Méthode Ancestrale as nothing more than an interchangeable fancy marketing term for a PetNat wine or Pétillant Natural wine. But then many folk, myself included, would be wrong. We'll talk more about that later. RebelRebel is a young but exciting initiative birthed by winemaker Kaylee Hutting, who is currently the lead winemaker at Kaapstad Estate in the Bottleray Hills of Stellenbosch. The name is inspired by the David Bowie song RebelRebel, which at a surface reading seems to be about defying categorization or finding joy outside of the confines of societal norms. And this explains perhaps why Kaylee's first white wine under the RebelRebel label was itself a jab at staid traditional categorization when she produced a still dry colombard wine, which is a grape more often categorized as being used to make brandy. Likewise, her Méthode Ancestrale is a sparkling wine made from Cinsault, from vines that were planted in 1991, and which departs from the more common categorizations of sparkling wine, like the traditional method or tank method or carbonated method, and instead chooses to embrace a slightly older method. This ancestral method was thought to have been initiated originally by Benedictine monks in the Languedoc region in the middle of the 16th century. This was about 140 years before the first traditional method or Méthode champenoise wines were made. But we can talk about the difference between those two methods on another day. Now, when we get into the glass, I'd love to be able to tell you what you should be smelling. But the fact is that when it comes to PetNat or Méthode Ancestrale or even champagne, the wine bottles are actually sealed while there's still quite a lot of fermentation work to be done. And so when these bottles are sealed, they become their own little unique universes that must follow their own little unique path. And sometimes the path of fermentation can be unpredictable. Obviously, at the highest level of production, Cap Classique producers and champagne houses have shown that extremely reliable replication is possible from bottle to bottle. But in the Wild West world of Méthode Ancestrale, this is not always the case. Partially because the wine is actually put into the bottle in the middle of its primary fermentation. This means that the very first bottle that is filled will have a lot more residual sugar in the bottle than the very last bottle that is filled. Because all that while, the wine that is sitting in its stainless steel tank is fermenting and the yeasts are consuming sugars and giving off CO2 and alcohol. So by the time the bottling process is finished, that last bottle has far less residual sugar, and therefore the yeast has far less work to do, will produce far less CO2, and so there will be a slightly lower pressure in the bottle. Now, the little technical nuances and how winemaker Kaylee Hutting actually gets around this and manages to produce a relatively reliable replication from bottle to bottle, it really is fascinating. But again, we're going to have to talk about that on another day because we need to get into the glass. Now, when I give my glass a sniff, and it might be different to yours, well, it smells, I guess, a little bit like a fresh cherry Danish. You have these lovely, fresh, vibrant red berry notes, cherries, obviously, toffee apple, a little bit of musk candy. But then I really am burying the headline because through all of that, especially right after opening, there's this amazing, rich, leesy, yeasty element right through the middle of it all, which is not unlike the middle of a fresh baked croissant. So when we take a sip, well, all those vibrant red fruits really do follow onto the palate. So there's pomegranate and cherry, maybe even a little bit of red plum. But then there's the texture of the mousse itself, which brings a lovely creaminess to it all. Then, as the wine slowly starts to warm in the glass, the fruit sweetens up a little bit and our perception of acidity tails off. And you've got the combination of the lees, and then also the mousse itself and the slightly sweeter fruit, and this all combines to form this rather amazing strawberries and cream type effort in the glass, which is stupendous. Now, I must confess that up until very recently, I thought that a Pétillant Naturel, or PetNat, if you want to be street, was simply a wine that was made via the technique of méthode ancestrale, or ancestral method, if you want to be English. But it just ain't so. Winemaker Kaylee Hutting explains to me that while the steps to make a PetNat are the same as the steps to make méthode ancestrale, the timing is a little different. With PetNat, you move the wine into bottle later on in its primary fermentation. So the yeast has less work to do in the bottle, which means it produces less CO2 and builds up lower pressure. Usually gets to about 2 or 3 bars of pressure in a bottle of PetNat. Méthode ancestrale is moved into bottle a lot earlier, so it spends more time fermenting in bottle and therefore builds up more pressure, usually reaching about 4 bars of pressure. To give you one last reference point, a bottle of Cap Classique in South Africa or a bottle of champagne in France will reach up to 6 bars of pressure, which is 2 to 3 times the pressure in a car tire, I guess, depending on the car. Legend has it that on a warm day, opening a bottle of champagne can propel a cork at speeds of up to 80 kilometers an hour. Needless to say, whether you're opening Méthode Ancestrale or champagne, you need to warn the elderly and people with pacemakers. One last thing to note about the notably high pressure in a bottle of champagne or Cap Classique is that they kind of cheat in order to get there, because they have an entire second fermentation which happens entirely in bottle. Again, the differences in those processes can be discussed on another day because we are out of time. If you have any questions about Méthode Ancestrale, PetNat, or the traditional method, then drop the questions onto the website and I will get back to you as soon as possible. If you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon so that we can make more of these videos. And subscribe to the Hendrik Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars like Kaylee Hutting, who are coming out of the dynamic South African wineland.